In a single, shattering moment on live television, former President Barack Obama moved to destroy Donald Trump's legacy. But what he didn't see coming was Vice President J.D. Vance, who rose with a thunderous rebuttal that didn't just defend a president. It exposed a truth so raw it left a former leader speechless and a nation in tears. This was the moment the game changed forever. The air in the studio was thick, heavy with anticipation, and the low hum of power generators. The lights overhead weren't just bright, they were oppressive, beating down with a physical heat that made sweat bead on the brows of even the most seasoned crew members. They bleached the color from the room, turning the deep blue backdrop into a stark, almost sterile canvas upon which history was about to be painted. Across the nation, tens of millions of Americans were frozen in place. In living rooms from the quiet suburbs of Ohio to the bustling apartments of New York City, families sat gathered, their voices hushed, their eyes locked on their screens. In diners along forgotten highways, truckers and waitresses paused, coffee mugs halfway to their lips, watching the small televisions mounted in the corners. This wasn't just another political event. It was a showdown, a clash of titans that had been brewing for nearly a decade. On one side of the gleaming mahogany stage sat Barack Obama. He was the image of practiced composure, his suit perfectly tailored, his posture relaxed. But it was a deceptive calm. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, held a glint of something cold, something predatory. He had the air of a man who had walked onto a battlefield he believed was already won, a chess master ready to declare checkmate. On the other side, President Donald Trump sat not as a politician, but as a force of nature. His presence was a gravitational pull, bending the energy of the entire room toward him. He was still, his hands resting on the desk before him, his gaze fixed forward. There was no fidgeting, no sign of nerves, only the immense grounded weight of a man who had weathered every storm imaginable and remained standing. He was a lion in winter, quiet, watching, his power coiled and waiting. And positioned between these two colossal figures was Vice President J.D. Vance. To some, he might have seemed out of place, younger, less known on the global stage, a scholar among warriors. But those who looked closer saw something else. He was the anchor in the storm. His stillness was not passivity, it was a profound, rooted strength. His eyes, clear and unblinking, missed nothing. They swept from Obama to Trump to the moderators to the audience, taking in every detail, every subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if he knew the precise moment the lightning would strike. Lead moderator, a woman with a voice known for its measured calm, seemed to struggle to maintain it. Her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she held her question cards. She cleared her throat, and the sound echoed in the deafening silence that had fallen over the studio. "Mr. President, Mr. Obama," she began, her voice tight, "we are 200 days into President Trump's second term. The first question is for you, Mr. Obama. What is your assessment of the state of our nation today?" The question hung in the air, a spark thrown into a room filled with gasoline. The crowd held its collective breath. The low hum of the cameras was the only sound. Then, with the slow, deliberate movement of a man savoring his moment, Obama leaned forward. The microphone picked up the faint whisper of his suit jacket against the polished wood of the desk. He didn't just speak. He unleashed a current of pure, unadulterated disdain. His voice, usually so smooth and melodic, was now laced with a venomous edge. "The state of our nation," he began, a cold, mirthless smile touching his lips. He turned his head slightly, not to the moderator, but directly to Donald Trump. "I think the state of our nation is a catastrophe. In just 200 days, you have managed to rip the soul out of this country, Donald." A shockwave, not a ripple, went through the audience. It was a physical jolt, a collective gasp that seemed to suck the air from the room. Trump did not flinch. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes narrowed by a fraction of an inch. Beside him, a single muscle pulsed in J.D. Vance's jaw. It was the only sign of the fury brewing beneath his calm exterior. He did not move. He did not look away. He simply watched. Obama pressed on, his voice rising, each word a carefully sharpened dagger aimed at the heart of the Trump presidency. "You have taken every ounce of progress, every bridge we built, every alliance we nurtured over 8 years, and you have set it on fire. You govern with chaos, you speak with arrogance, and you lead with a recklessness that borders on insanity. America has made a grave, historic mistake, and the world is watching us in horror. The attack was brutal, personal, and delivered with the chilling precision of a surgeon. The studio audience was now a roiling sea of conflicted emotion. Some began to clap, their applause sharp and scattered. Others let out boos, a low, guttural sound of disapproval. Reporters in the back rows were typing with a furious intensity, their faces illuminated by the glow of their laptops. Headlines were being written in real time. But the most striking thing was the silence from the president's chair. Trump sat back, allowing the verbal onslaught to wash over him, his face a mask of stone. The cameras zoomed in, searching for a crack, a flicker of anger or weakness, but found none. He was letting Obama exhaust himself, letting him show his hand. Obama's eyes flashed with a triumphant fire as he prepared to deliver what he thought would be the killing blow. "You are an aberration," he declared, his voice ringing with self-righteous fury. "You have diminished the office, you have betrayed our values, and you have brought nothing but shame upon the resolute desk. You are a stain on our history." The finality in his tone was absolute. He leaned back, a flicker of a smirk playing on his lips as if the match were already over. The moderators looked at each other, stunned, unsure of how to regain control. The air crackled, thick with the aftermath of the explosion. But in that critical, suspended moment, the focus of millions of Americans and indeed the world began to shift. It moved away from the aggressor, Obama, and past the silent president. It settled with an almost tangible weight on the one man who had not yet spoken a word. It settled on J.D. Vance. The vice president slowly, deliberately placed both of his hands flat on the desk. He leaned forward, not with aggression, but with an immense, grounded certainty. His gaze, which had been observing, now sharpened, locking directly onto Barack Obama. It was a look devoid of fear, devoid of hesitation. It was the look of a man who had come prepared for this exact moment. The entire studio seemed to sense the shift. The whispers died down. The audience leaned forward. Even Obama, in his moment of perceived triumph, paused, his head tilting slightly as if to say, "Go on, I dare you." The storm had arrived, and J.D. Vance was about to unleash the thunder. To understand the seismic power of the moment that was about to unfold, one had to understand the man at its center. J.D. Vance was not born in the polished halls of Washington, D.C. He was forged in the fire and rust of Middletown, Ohio, a place where the American dream had been packed up, sold for parts, and shipped overseas. He was a son of the forgotten, a product of the very people the coastal elites spoke of in condescending whispers, if they spoke of them at all. His was a story written in the calloused hands of steelworkers, in the worried eyes of mothers watching their sons fall to despair, and in the quiet dignity of a people who refused to break even after their world had been shattered. He had walked a path few could comprehend. He had escaped the gravity of Appalachia, made his way through the hallowed gates of Yale Law School, a place that served as the very heart of the system that had left his home to die. He had seen the other side. He had sat in classrooms with the future architects of globalism, the future orchestrators of the managed decline of the American heartland. He had listened to their theories, their elegant justifications for policies that felt like a death sentence back home. And unlike them, he had never forgotten the faces of the people those policies destroyed. He carried their ghosts with him. His journey wasn't a rejection of his past. It was a pilgrimage to understand the forces that had declared war on it. When Donald Trump first descended that golden escalator in 2015, Vance, like many intellectuals, had been skeptical. Trump was loud, brash, a sledgehammer in a world of political scalpels. But as he listened, truly listened past the noise and the media outrage, he heard something else. He heard a voice that, for the first time, spoke not asterisk about the people of the Rust Belt, but to asterisk them. Trump didn't offer pity. He offered a fight. He didn't speak of inevitable economic change. He spoke of stolen jobs and bad deals. He didn't see a region to be managed. He saw a nation to be reclaimed. For Vance, it was a revelation. He realized that the polished, eloquent speeches of leaders like Barack Obama were a beautiful anesthetic, designed to soothe the patient while the country bled out. Trump was the surgeon who ripped off the bandage and showed everyone the wound. That realization changed everything. Vance became one of the most powerful intellectual defenders of the movement, not because he agreed with every tweet, but because he understood the profound, earth-shattering truth at its core. The system was rigged, and Donald Trump was the only one with the courage to say it out loud. When Trump chose him as his running mate for his second term, the political establishment was baffled. They saw a mismatch, the populist brawler and the thoughtful author. They couldn't have been more wrong. Trump didn't choose an apprentice. He chose a successor to the spirit of the fight. He saw in Vance a man who had the mind of an Ivy League scholar but the heart of an Appalachian warrior. He saw someone who could articulate the movement's soul, who could wield the truth with the precision of a surgeon's blade, while Trump continued to wield the hammer. In the 200 days of their second term, their partnership had become legendary within the West Wing. They were a study in contrasts that formed a perfect whole. In the Oval Office, Trump would pace, his energy filling the room, his instincts firing off ideas and directives. Vance would sit, listening, absorbing, and then with quiet clarity he would distill the strategy, identify the pressure points, and articulate the path forward. Trump trusted Vance's intellect implicitly, and Vance revered Trump's unbreakable courage. They shared a silent understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of constant attack from a hostile media, a deep state, and a political class that saw their very existence as an existential threat. Now sitting on that debate stage, Vance was not just a vice president defending his president. He was the culmination of a journey. He was the voice of Middletown, of the steel mills, of the grandmothers who raised him, of every American who had been told they were backward, deplorable, and on the wrong side of history. He looked at Barack Obama, and he didn't see a revered former president. He saw the embodiment of the elegant, smiling decline. He saw the man whose policies had hollowed out the country, while he delivered soaring speeches about hope. He saw the architect of the very despair that had fueled the movement that brought him to this stage. The weight of millions rested on his shoulders. The unspoken prayers of families in forgotten towns echoed in his ears. He was their defender, their champion, their last best hope. The studio lights felt like interrogation's lamps. The silence was a vacuum and the world held its breath. Obama's smirk remained, confident and dismissive. Trump's gaze was fixed on his vice president, a silent signal of unwavering trust. Vance took a slow, deep breath. The air filled his lungs, a final moment of calm before the declaration of war. He was ready. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. Barack Obama leaned back in his chair, the faint creak of expensive leather a subtle punctuation to his verbal assault. He allowed a moment of silence to hang in the air, letting the weight of his words settle upon the room, upon the nation. In that moment he felt it again, the old power, the familiar current of control that had defined his political life. He was not just a former president. He was an idea, a symbol of a world order he believed was intelligent, sophisticated, and correct. And for 8 years the world had agreed. His presidency had been more than a term in office. It was a coronation of a worldview. He was the man who had calmed the waters, who had mended alliances with eloquent apologies and promises of a more collaborative future. His voice was his greatest weapon, a finely tuned instrument that could weave spells of hope and change, making even the most bitter pills of policy taste sweet to the masses. He spoke, and the world listened. He smiled, and the media swooned. He was the walking embodiment of a globalist dream, a leader celebrated in the gilded halls of Davos and the lavish editorial boardrooms of New York. He moved through a world that reflected his own image back at him. He saw himself as a figure of history, a philosopher king who had ascended to the highest office to guide a messy, emotional America toward a more enlightened, rational future. The factories that closed in the Midwest were not tragedies to him, but the unfortunate but necessary casualties of progress, the painful but logical march toward a global economy. The borders that softened were not a failure of security, but a testament to a more compassionate, borderless world. He believed, with an almost religious conviction, that he was bending the arc of history toward justice, and anyone who stood in the way was not just wrong. They were backward, an obstacle to be managed, educated, or overcome. Then came 2016. The election of Donald Trump was not a political defeat for Barack Obama. It was a personal, soul-crushing repudiation. It was as if the entire country, the people he had tried to elevate, had looked at his carefully constructed masterpiece and taken a sledgehammer to it. Trump's victory was a visceral scream from the very heart of the nation he thought he understood, a nation he had tried to shepherd into the future. They had rejected his future. They had chosen a man who was his polar opposite, loud where he was measured, blunt where he was nuanced, a nationalist brawler where he was a global statesman. The shock was profound, an existential wound that festered deep within his psyche. It was an insult that could not be forgiven. It was a mistake that had to be undone. In the years that followed his presidency, he did not fade into the quiet life of a retired statesman. He became a ghost in the machine, the center of a powerful and silent resistance. He saw himself not as a citizen, but as a guardian of a sacred flame, a man tasked with protecting the country from itself. From his multi-million-dollar mansions, he watched, he advised, he maneuvered. The Russia collusion narrative, a shadow that crippled the first Trump term, was not just politics to him. It was a righteous crusade, a necessary tool to delegitimize the man who had stolen his legacy. When the time came, he saw in Joe Biden not a vibrant leader, but a vessel, a familiar, comforting face that could be used to reclaim the throne, a placeholder through which the correct order of things could be restored. He had pulled the strings, believing he was saving the republic, never once considering that his actions were the very definition of the betrayal he accused others of. Now sitting on this stage, he felt the vindication he had craved for years. He had come here tonight not to debate, but to execute. He had unleashed his full rhetorical fury on Trump, and the president had sat there and taken it. The silence in Obama's mind was an admission of guilt. He had exposed the king, and now all that was left was to deal with his court. He looked at J.D. Vance, who was now leaning forward, his hands flat on the desk. He saw not a threat, but an afterthought, a footnote. In his world, a man like Vance was a curiosity, a bright boy from a broken place who had somehow found his way to the big leagues but had foolishly chosen the wrong team. He saw an apprentice, a mouthpiece tasked with the impossible job of defending the indefensible. He felt a flicker of something almost like pity for the young man. He was about to be destroyed, and he didn't even see it coming. Obama's faint, condescending smile remained fixed on his face. He held Vance's gaze, his eyes cold and unwavering, a silent challenge. "Go ahead, son," the look said. "Show me what you've got." He was utterly unprepared for the fact that J.D. Vance was not there to defend a president. He was there to prosecute a legacy, and the evidence was the pain of a nation. J.D. Vance inhaled. It was not a nervous gasp for air, nor the shallow breath of a man preparing to speak. It was a slow, deep, and deliberate act of will, as if he were drawing into himself all the tension, all the silence, all the unspoken rage of the millions watching. The sound was almost imperceptible, yet it seemed to create a vacuum in the studio. The low hum of the electronics faded. The rustling of papers stopped. The very air, sterile and recycled, seemed to grow still and heavy. For a single, eternal second, the world was frozen. Obama's condescending smile was fixed in place, a mask of arrogant amusement. The moderators sat like statues, their professional composure shattered. Trump remained a figure of granite, but his eyes, for the first time, shifted with a flicker of something profound, absolute trust. Then Vance spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not boom through the studio. It cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, steady, and utterly devastating. "Mr. Obama," he began. The two words landed with the force of a physical blow. It was the title, the honorific, spoken not with deference but with a chilling formality that stripped away all the warmth and familiarity the former president commanded. It was a summons, a calling to account. On Obama's face, the smile faltered. It didn't vanish, not yet, but a crack appeared in the facade, a momentary flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had expected a defense of Trump. He had not expected to be addressed directly, to be put on trial himself. Vance held the pause, letting the two words hang in the air, forcing everyone in the room, everyone in the nation, to focus on the man he had just named. Then he delivered the sentence that would ignite a firestorm. "You've said enough." The words were brutally simple, 4 syllables, but they carried the weight of a final judgment. It was not a request, it was a command. In that instant, the power dynamic of the entire evening, of the entire political era, was inverted. The crowd was paralyzed. No one clapped, no one booed. There was only a vast, collective, and stunned silence. It was the sound of 1,000 narratives shattering at once. A reporter in the back row let her pen slip from her fingers, the clatter on the floor sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. Obama's face changed. The last remnants of his smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated disbelief. His jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing violently at its hinge. His eyes, once cold and confident, now flashed with a dark, rising fury. He had not been spoken to this way in over a decade. Before the shock could even register, before Obama could formulate a reply, Vance moved to his next point of attack. He shifted his body, a subtle, deliberate turn of his shoulders. It was a masterful move. He was no longer just speaking to Obama on the stage. He was turning to face the jury, the American people watching at home. He looked directly into the main camera, and in that moment, he was in every living room, every diner, every barracks in the country. He was speaking to them. "You call President Trump a lunatic," Vance said, his voice now rising, infused with a fire that was not hot and reckless but cold and intensely focused. "A disgrace." He repeated the word, letting its venom hang in the air. "Let's talk about disgrace, sir. Let's talk about what real betrayal looks like." Gasps, sharp and audible, finally erupted from the audience. It was like a dam breaking. People leaned forward, their hands covering their mouths, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and exhilaration. Obama opened his mouth as if to speak, to cut him off, but Vance's pace was relentless. He gave him no room. "Let's talk about 2016, Vance pressed on, his voice a hammer striking steel. "When the American people spoke, when they chose a different path, you didn't accept their voice. You, alongside Hillary Clinton and James Comey, chose to manufacture a lie. You pushed the Russia collusion hoax, a poison you knowingly injected into the heart of this country to try and overturn a democratic election." The room exploded. It was not applause, it was a roar of raw, pent-up emotion. A wave of shock, of anger, of validation crashed through the studio. Obama physically recoiled as if he had been struck. His face, which had been tight with anger, was now pale, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. This wasn't a policy debate. This was an indictment. Vance had not come to argue. He had come to prosecute. He pointed, not with an accusatory finger but with his gaze, pinning Obama in his seat. "That wasn't just politics, Mr. Obama. That was a betrayal of the highest order. A betrayal of the very people you swore an oath to serve." The word hung in the air, an unerasable stain. Betrayal. In that single moment, J.D. Vance had done the unthinkable. He had taken the untouchable legacy of Barack Obama and branded it with the most damning word in the American political lexicon. The former president's confident smile was a distant memory, replaced by the grim, clenched jaw of a man who realized, far too late, that he had not walked into a debate. He had walked into a reckoning. The roar of the audience was a physical force, a tidal wave of sound that shook the very foundation of the studio. In the control room, producers stared at their monitors, their mouths agape, forgotten headsets dangling around their necks. On the screen, the needle of the audio meter was buried in the red, pulsing with the raw, unfiltered emotion of the crowd. This was no longer a debate to be managed. It was a wildfire. On stage, Barack Obama sat frozen in the inferno. The pale shock on his face was now hardening into a dark, simmering rage. His hands, which had rested calmly on the desk, were now clenched into tight fists, his knuckles white under the harsh studio lights. He looked like a king who had just watched a peasant storm his castle and tear down his sigil. The aura of untouchable prestige that had surrounded him for years was dissolving in real time, burned away by the searing heat of Vance's accusation. Trump, for his part, remained an island of calm in the chaos. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a slight turn of his head toward Vance, and gave a single, slow nod. It was a silent affirmation, a transfer of command. It said, "This is your fight. Win it." And Vance, fueled by that trust, pressed his advantage with the cold precision of a grandmaster. He let the audience's roar begin to subside, timing his next words to land in the charged silence that followed. "You talk about arrogance," Vance continued, his voice cutting through the residual noise, clear and sharp as glass. He leaned further into the microphone, his eyes never leaving Obama's. "But what is more arrogant than believing you have the right to nullify the votes of 63 million Americans? What is more arrogant than sitting in the Oval Office, as you did in the final days of your term, and personally overseeing the genesis of a lie designed to cripple the next president before he even took the oath? This was not a general accusation. It was a specific, targeted strike, aimed at a truth that had been buried for years under layers of media obfuscation and political spin. Vance was referencing the now declassified records, the footnotes of history that the establishment had prayed everyone would forget. He was talking about the meetings, the sign-offs, the intelligence products that were twisted and weaponized not to protect the country, but to protect a political dynasty. Obama's eyes widened. This was a place he never thought the debate would go. He had expected a defense of Trump's policies, a shouting match about the economy or foreign affairs. He was prepared for that. He was not prepared for a forensic examination of his own actions, of the shadows of his own administration. "That is a lie," Obama snapped, his voice tight and strained, the first words he had managed to utter. But the denial was weak, brittle. It lacked the resonant authority that had once defined him. It sounded hollow, defensive. Vance didn't even flinch. He responded not with anger but with cold, hard facts. "Is it a lie, sir?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm, the question of a prosecutor cornering a witness. "Is it a lie that your FBI used a dossier funded by your chosen successor's campaign to get a secret warrant to spy on the opposition? Is it a lie that your intelligence chiefs leaked classified information to a compliant press to create a narrative of treason? These aren't opinions. These are facts. Facts you have spent years trying to bury." Each question was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Obama's narrative. In living rooms across America, people who had only heard whispers of these details, who had been told for years it was all a conspiracy theory, were now hearing it laid bare on the biggest stage in the world. A woman in Michigan, a lifelong Democrat who had voted for Obama twice, turned to her husband, her face etched with confusion and a dawning sense of betrayal. "Did that really happen?" she whispered. Vance's voice grew stronger, imbued with a righteous passion. "You talk about a threat to democracy, but you were the threat. You weaponized the most powerful institutions of the United States government against a political opponent. You set a precedent that this country may never recover from. You didn't just bend the rules, Mr. Obama. You tried to break the republic." The audience was no longer just a collection of individuals. They had become a single, unified body, breathing in unison, hanging on every word. The scattered claps and boos were gone, replaced by a profound, attentive silence. They were not watching a performance. They were receiving a history lesson they had been denied for years. The camera zoomed in on Obama's face. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, glistening under the hot lights. He was trapped. To deny the specifics would be to lie, and the evidence was now too public. To admit them would be to confess to an abuse of power so profound it would shatter his legacy forever. He was silent, cornered, defeated. And in that crushing silence, J.D. Vance delivered the final, devastating blow of his cross-examination. "So you can sit here tonight and call this president a lunatic. You can call him a disgrace. But the American people now know the truth. The only disgrace here is a former president who tried to undo an election because he couldn't stand that the people chose to be forgotten no more." The words landed with the force of a death sentence. The trial was over. The verdict was in. The crowd, released from its stunned silence, erupted not just in applause, but in a cathartic, thunderous ovation that felt as if it could shake the very heavens. It was not a wave. It was a digital tsunami. Before the last echo of Vance's words had faded from the studio, the internet was already on fire. Twitter's servers strained under the load as millions of clips of the exchange, subtitled in real time by users around the globe, were uploaded and shared. Hashtags bloomed in a split second, not just in English, but in dozens of languages. "Vance exposes Obama, the debate that shook the world, truth to power." On Facebook, videos were being shared by the hundreds of thousands every minute. Grandmothers in Texas and young students in California adding captions like, "Finally, the truth is spoken." On TikTok, a new generation that had grown up hearing only of Obama's flawless legacy was now seeing a different story. Their screens filled with powerful, 60-second edits of Vance's methodical takedown, set to dramatic, world-changing music. In the glass-walled newsrooms of CNN and the New York Times, chaos reigned. Pre-written headlines, drafted hours in advance, now seemed like relics from a forgotten era. "Obama schools Trump in masterful return." Editors, their faces pale in the glow of their monitors, screamed for rewrites. "Kill it! Kill the whole front page, the story is Vance. The narrative they had spent weeks carefully crafting, the triumphant return of the statesman to put the populist in his place, had been obliterated in less than 5 minutes. Pundits who were scheduled to go on air with talking points about Obama's brilliance now stared blankly at the teleprompters, their prepared speeches turned to ash in their mouths. They were witnessing a black swan event, a political earthquake, and they had no script for it. The shockwave radiated outward, crossing oceans and time zones in an instant. In London, the BBC cut away from its scheduled programming to show the debate live. In a pub in Dublin, the chatter of a football match fell silent as patrons turned to stare at the screen, one man whispering to his friend, "My God, he's tearing him apart." In Berlin, German politicians who had revered Obama as the leader of the free world watched with a dawning sense of unease. They were seeing the myth dismantled, the carefully polished image of American liberalism being shattered by a voice from the heartland they had never bothered to understand. In a high-tech boardroom in Tokyo, executives paused a presentation, mesmerized by the raw display of American political combat. In Jerusalem, military analysts watched with keen interest, seeing not just a debate, but a fundamental shift in the strength and character of their greatest ally. Back in America, the reaction was not one of political analysis. It was something far deeper, far more personal. In a VFW hall in rural Pennsylvania, a group of elderly veterans who had gathered to watch the debate in silence stood as one and began to applaud, tears streaming down their weathered faces. One man, a Marine who had fought in Fallujah, simply saluted the screen, his hand trembling. In a fire station in Chicago, firefighters paused their dinner, listening to Vance's words echo through the bay. One of them slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "That's what I've been saying for years." A sentiment that was being repeated in countless homes and workplaces across the nation. But the most profound reaction was the quiet one. It was the mother in Ohio, holding her sleeping child, weeping silently as she heard a leader finally speak of the betrayal she had felt when her husband's factory closed. It was the young trucker, pulled over at a rest stop in Nebraska, watching on his phone and feeling a surge of pride and hope he thought had been lost forever. It was the sense of vindication, the feeling of being seen, of being heard, that washed over millions of people who had been dismissed as deplorable, forgotten, and irrelevant. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was thick enough to taste. Obama could feel the shift, not just in the room but in the world. His power had always been derived from his image, from the global consensus that he was a man of unimpeachable character and intellect. He could feel that consensus cracking, shattering into a million pieces. The blood had drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor under the billion-lumen lights. His jaw was a knot of stone, but it was his eyes that told the real story. The fury was still there, but beneath it was something new, something he had not felt in decades, a cold, creeping dread. It was the look of a man watching his own monument being dismantled, stone by stone, in front of the entire world. He was no longer a former president in a debate. He was a man on a shrinking island with the tide of public opinion rushing in from all sides, and he was utterly, completely alone. The thunderous ovation began to recede, not into silence, but into a low, rumbling hum of electricity. It was the sound of a crowd that had just witnessed a revolution and was now waiting for the old regime to fall. Every eye in the studio, every camera lens, every pair of eyes in the watching world was fixed on Barack Obama. This was his moment to respond, to salvage what was left of his legacy, to push back against the tide that threatened to drown him. The moderators, recovering from their own shock, turned to him. One of them, a veteran journalist known for his unflappable demeanor, now looked visibly shaken. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense air. "Mr. Obama," he began, his voice barely a whisper, a response. Obama did not move for a long moment. He seemed to be gathering himself, drawing on every reserve of the legendary composure that had carried him to the pinnacle of world power. He slowly unclasped his hands, placing them flat on the desk, mirroring the posture Vance had taken moments before. It was a conscious attempt to project a calm he did not feel. He straightened his suit jacket, a small, almost fussy gesture that betrayed his inner turmoil. Finally, he leaned forward. When he spoke, He attempted to recapture the old magic, the smooth, condescending tone of a professor correcting a promising but misguided student. JD, he began, the use of the first name a deliberate attempt to diminish him to re-establish the hierarchy of the room. He forced a thin, brittle smile. That's a very compelling story, a well-rehearsed piece of political theater. The words were sharp, intended to cut, to dismiss everything Vance had said as a mere performance. But the American people are smarter than that. They know the difference between angry talking points and real leadership. He tried to lock eyes with Vance, to stare him down, but Vance's gaze was unyielding, a placid lake of conviction that refused to be disturbed. Obama turned his attention away from Vance, trying to connect with the audience, with the cameras, with the America he believed still revered him. "This man," he said, gesturing dismissively toward President Trump, "has shattered our alliances. He has cozied up to dictators while alienating our oldest friends. He has treated the presidency not as a sacred trust but as a reality television show. And you," he sneered, his gaze snapping back to Vance, "have chosen to be his chief apologist. You think defending this chaos makes you a patriot. It makes you an accomplice." The attack was vintage Obama, eloquent, cutting, and designed to frame the argument on his terms. In another time, in another room, it would have worked. The crowd would have erupted in applause. The headlines would have been written. But tonight, the magic failed. The words fell flat, landing in the charged atmosphere with a dull thud. The audience did not respond. There were no cheers, only a few scattered, half-hearted claps that died almost as soon as they began. The silence that met his words was more damning than any boo could have been. It was the silence of a people who were no longer under his spell. And in that moment of profound, deafening silence, J.D. Vance delivered the blow that would change the course of the night, and perhaps the course of history. He did not raise his voice. He did not sneer. He simply waited for Obama to finish, let the emptiness of the response settle over the room, and then he replied with a calm, devastating clarity. "Sir," he began, the honorific now dripping with an almost surgical irony, "I'm not his apologist. I am his vice president, elected by the same people you tried to disenfranchise, trusted by the same people you ignored for 8 years." The audience began to murmur, a low growl of approval. Vance leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more personal, drawing every listener closer. "And unlike your administration, Mr. Obama, we don't answer to the global elites at Davos. We don't answer to the multinational corporations who ship our jobs overseas. We don't answer to the media who protect you. We answer to the American people." The room exploded. This time it was not just a roar of anger or shock. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated pride. It was a declaration of independence. People leaped to their feet, their applause thundering through the studio. A woman in the front row, tears streaming down her face, screamed, "Yes, tell him." A man in a Union t-shirt began to chant, "USA, USA." And soon the entire room had joined in, a deafening chorus that drowned out everything else. Obama's face crumbled. The mask of composure shattered completely, revealing the raw, stunned fury beneath. For the first time, he looked truly lost, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape, for an ally, for a single face that wasn't looking at him with either righteous anger or profound disappointment. He had walked into this debate believing he was the voice of the people. In one stunning, brutal moment, J.D. Vance had proven that he was the one who had been left behind. The turning point had been reached. The tide had not just shifted, it had become an unstoppable flood, and Barack Obama was now completely, utterly submerged. The chant of USA was no longer just a sound. It had become a physical entity, a living, breathing force that filled every square inch of the studio. It vibrated through the floorboards, pulsed against the camera lenses, and beat against the chests of everyone present. The multi-million-dollar soundproofing of the room was useless against it. This was not the polite, rhythmic chant of a political rally. This was a visceral roar, a cry of liberation from a people who had been silent for too long. The moderators were completely irrelevant now. They sat frozen, their carefully prepared questions lying forgotten on the desk, their faces a mixture of professional terror and personal awe. They were no longer directing a debate. They were simply witnesses to a historical event that had spiraled far beyond their control. Barack Obama was at the epicenter of this storm, and for the first time in his public life he was utterly powerless. The chant was a physical assault, each syllable a hammer blow against the walls of his self-possession. He could feel his authority, once a global currency, being rendered worthless. He tried to speak. He leaned forward, his mouth opening, but his voice was swallowed whole by the deafening chorus. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. He was a silent film actor in a world that had suddenly found its voice. A hot, dark flush crept up his neck, coloring his pale face. The veins on his forehead stood out, a stark road map of his rising fury and utter helplessness. He tried again, this time shouting, his voice raw and strained, a desperate, ugly sound that was completely alien to the smooth, controlled cadence the world knew. "This nation is divided because of him," he yelled, stabbing a trembling finger in the direction of Donald Trump. His recklessness, his lies. But it was useless. The crowd did not hear him, or if they did not care. His words were just meaningless debris tossed into the teeth of a hurricane. The roar of USA only grew louder in response, a direct and brutal rejection of his last, desperate plea. He slumped back in his chair, the fight visibly draining out of him. The look in his eyes was no longer just anger. It was the hollow, haunted look of a man who had lost everything. Then a new power made itself known. J.D. Vance, who had sat calm and centered through the eruption he had caused, slowly raised his hand. It was not a grand gesture, just a quiet, simple motion, but it had the effect of a conductor's baton. As if obeying a silent command, the roar of the crowd began to subside. The chant did not stop abruptly. It softened, receded, and finally fell into a tense, expectant silence, leaving only the ringing in the ears and the palpable thrum of raw emotion in the air. In that moment, Vance demonstrated a control over the room, over the people, that Obama in his prime could only have dreamed of. He had not just won the argument, he had won the loyalty of the crowd. He let the silence hold for a beat, allowing the full weight of Obama's defeat to register. Then he leaned forward, and his voice, now calm and measured, sliced through the quiet. "You accuse President Trump of dividing America," he said, his tone that of a man delivering a final, unassailable truth. "But you divided this nation long before he ever came down that escalator, Mr. Obama." The former president looked up, his eyes glassy with a mixture of rage and shock. Vance's gaze was like a physical weight, pinning him in his chair. "You divided it when you promised hope and change, and then presided over the decay of the American heartland. You divided it when you told workers whose jobs were being shipped to China that their despair was just the price of progress. You sold them out. You sold out their towns, their children, their future. And while their factories were being turned to rust, you and your friends on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley got richer than any elite in human history." The words were not shouted. They were delivered with a cold, devastating precision. Each sentence was a chapter in a story of betrayal that millions of Americans knew in their bones. This was the setup for the kill. Vance was no longer just talking about political maneuvering in Washington. He was now speaking of the soul of the country, of the deep, festering wounds that Obama's polished speeches had been designed to hide. He paused, letting the indictment sink in. The camera focused on a man in the audience, a former auto worker from Detroit, whose face was a mask of grief, tears carving clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He was nodding slowly, as if Vance were speaking the words that had been locked in his own heart for years. Then Vance moved in for the final, most personal and most damning charge. He lowered his voice even further, forcing everyone to lean in, to listen with breathless intensity. "And let's be clear about what true corruption looks like," he said, his eyes boring into Obama's. "It's not just about selling out jobs. It's about propping up a man you knew was unwell, a man who wasn't fit for office so you could maintain your power. You allowed Joe Biden to be pushed forward as a puppet, a figurehead, while you and your circle pulled the strings from behind the curtain." A collective gasp, sharp and horrified, swept through the studio. This was the accusation that had only been whispered in the darkest corners of the internet. Now, it was being spoken aloud on live television, for the entire world to hear. It was a charge of a betrayal so profound, so monstrous, it bordered on treason. Obama's face, already pale, turned a ghostly white. He looked as if J.D. Vance had reached across the desk and ripped the very soul from his body. The final battle was about to begin. The silence that followed Vance's accusation was absolute. It was a dead, airless void, the kind of silence that precedes a cataclysm. The accusation of using a compromised Joe Biden as a puppet was not just a political attack. It was a charge of monstrous, almost unimaginable deception. It recontextualized years of American history in a single, horrifying sentence. In the studio, the audience was paralyzed, their faces a gallery of shock and dawning comprehension. The sound of a woman in the third row beginning to sob, a low, heartbroken whimper, was the only thing that broke the stillness. Barack Obama stared at J.D. Vance, his face a canvas of utter devastation. The accusation had bypassed all his political defenses and struck at the very core of his identity as a statesman and a patriot. He was no longer a debater on a stage. He was a man accused of a crime against the Republic. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The practiced eloquence, the legendary command of language, had utterly abandoned him. He was, for the first time in his life, truly speechless. It was Trump who finally broke the spell. He had been watching the exchange with a quiet, intense focus, a general observing his best soldier win a decisive battle. He leaned slightly toward his microphone, not to speak himself, but to amplify the silence. He adjusted his tie, a small, deliberate movement that drew every camera to him, and then he simply looked at Obama, his expression not one of triumph, but of grave, profound disappointment. The look said everything. The truth is out. What will you do now? That silent judgment seemed to finally break through Obama's shock. A surge of pure, primal adrenaline coursed through him. He slammed his hand down on the mahogany desk, the sound cracking through the studio like a rifle shot. "How dare you?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous snarl that was unrecognizable as his own. "How dare you? You stand there and you spew these disgusting, baseless conspiracy theories." "Are they baseless, sir?" Vance interrupted, his voice still calm, a chilling counterpoint to Obama's raw fury. The American people saw him. They saw the confusion. They saw the weakness. They saw him being led by the hand. They're not blind. They're not stupid. They knew something was wrong. You just counted on the media to tell them not to believe their own eyes. "Joe Biden served this country with honor," Obama roared, his control completely gone, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "He was my vice president. He was a patriot. He was your shield," Vance countered, his voice like ice. "You hid behind his folksy persona while your people, the unelected, unaccountable ideologues you left behind, ran the country. You let our borders be erased. You let crime consume our cities. You let our enemies grow strong while you lectured us about pronouns and climate change. It all happened on your watch, even when you weren't officially in the chair. You were the shadow president of a managed decline. Lies, all of it. You're a liar." Obama was on his feet now, his chair pushed back, his body trembling with a rage he could no longer contain. The Secret Service agents at the edge of the stage tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their jackets. Vance remained seated, his stillness a stark contrast to Obama's explosive fury. He looked up at the former president, his gaze steady, almost sorrowful. "The truth isn't a lie just because you find it offensive, Mr. Obama. Look at the results. Look at the state of the world you left us. Look at the pain in this country. That is your legacy. That is the fruit of your leadership." "My legacy," Obama spat, his voice dripping with contempt, "was pulling this country back from the brink of a depression you Republicans caused. My legacy was restoring America's standing in the world after it had been destroyed by war. I gave people health care. I gave them hope." "You gave them false hope," Vance replied, his voice rising with passion for the first time, not with anger but with the force of a deep, unshakable conviction. "You gave them a piece of paper that said they had insurance but they couldn't afford the deductible. You told them the world respected us, while China ate our lunch and Russia walked all over us. You gave them speeches. President Trump gave them jobs. You gave them platitudes. He gave them a secure border. You told them to accept a weaker America as the new normal. He told them we could be great again. That's the difference. And that is why you hate him. Because he proved your entire worldview, your entire managed decline, was a lie." The final sentence hung in the air, a perfect and devastating summary of the entire conflict. The audience, which had been frozen by the raw confrontation, erupted. The sound was deafening, a roar of approval so total, so absolute, that it felt like the final verdict of history being delivered in real time. Obama stood there, trembling, his chest heaving, his face ashen. He looked out at the roaring crowd, at the sea of faces that were no longer looking at him with admiration but with judgment. He looked at Trump, who sat there, silent, the victor. He looked at Vance, the young man from a forgotten town who had just dismantled his entire life's work. In that moment, he knew it was over. Not just the debate, everything. He had been exposed, defeated, and silenced, not by a political rival, but by the raw, undeniable truth. He slowly, stiffly, sank back into his chair, a broken man. The roar did not simply fade. It collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the aftermath of a sonic boom. The air in the studio was thin, stripped of oxygen, charged with a strange, sacred stillness. No one moved. No one spoke. The audience, which moments before had been a single, roaring beast, was now 1,000 individual statues, their faces etched with the raw, transformative power of what they had just witnessed. They were no longer spectators. They were participants in a moment of history so pure and so brutal that it would be forever seared into the nation's memory. At the center of this vacuum sat Barack Obama, but it was not the same man who had walked onto the stage an hour and a half earlier. The confident stride, the easy smile, the aura of intellectual and moral superiority. It was all gone, stripped away layer by layer until only the raw, broken shell of a man remained. He sat slumped in his expensive chair, which now looked more like a throne of judgment than a seat of honor. His shoulders were rounded, his head bowed slightly, his gaze fixed on some meaningless point on the polished floor. The harsh studio lights, which had always been his ally, making his skin glow and his smile radiate, were now his enemy. They exposed every flaw, every flicker of despair, every glistening bead of sweat on his brow. He looked old. He looked fragile. He looked, for the first time, utterly and completely defeated. His hands rested in his lap, limp and lifeless. The fists that had been clenched in rage were now open, palms up, in a posture of complete surrender. His face was a hollow mask. The life, the fire, the calculating intelligence had been extinguished from his eyes, leaving behind a vacant, haunted stare. He was a man who had not just lost an argument. He had lost the narrative of his own life. The story he had told himself, the story he had told the world, that he was the arc of history, the voice of progress, the symbol of an enlightened America, had been proven a lie, and the truth that replaced it was an ugly, unbearable thing. He was the architect of decay, the purveyor of false hope, the man who had tried to silence the will of the people he claimed to love. He was a fallen idol, and the silence in the room was the sound of his myth crashing to earth. Across from him, J.D. Vance did not celebrate. There was no smirk of triumph, no gloating gesture. He sat with a profound and heavy stillness, his hands folded calmly on the desk. His expression was not one of victory, but of solemn duty. He looked like a man who had been called upon to perform a difficult but necessary surgery, and now that it was over, he was simply bearing witness to the stark, quiet aftermath. He had not come here for personal glory. He had come to speak a truth that a nation was desperate to hear, and now that it had been spoken, he seemed to carry the weight of its consequences with a quiet, humble strength. His calm was, in its own way, more devastating to Obama than any cheer could have been. It was the calm of a man who knew he had been on the right side of history. President Trump, seated beside him, slowly reached over and placed a hand on Vance's shoulder. It was a simple, powerful gesture. It was a transfer of trust, of pride, of a legacy now secured. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the image that would define the night. The old warrior, the man who had weathered every storm, giving his silent, profound approval to the young champion who had won the final battle. The image burned itself onto millions of screens, a tableau of strength, unity, and the passing of a torch. The moderators finally found their voices, though they were thin and trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of them stammered, his words sounding foolish and small in the cavernous silence, that concludes our debate. The formal announcement was a farce. The debate had been over for a long time. They went through the motions, thanking the participants, their voices cracking, but no one was listening. Slowly, as if awakening from a dream, the audience began to stir. There was no applause now. The moment was too heavy for that. Instead, a low, spontaneous sound began to fill the room. It was the sound of prayer. People bowed their heads. Strangers reached for each other's hands. Mothers clutched their children, their bodies shaking with silent, cathartic sobs. They were not tears of political victory. They were tears of relief, of healing, of a deep national wound finally being lanced. The studio had been transformed from a political stage into a sanctuary. Debate was over. The candidates began to rise. J.D. Vance and Donald Trump stood together, a united front, and turned to acknowledge the audience with a nod of gratitude. But Barack Obama rose alone. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at his opponents. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor as he turned and walked stiffly and slowly toward the exit. He did not shake a single hand. He did not wave. He simply walked away, a ghost leaving the scene of his own political death. The once great orator, the man who had commanded the world stage, was now just a silhouette, disappearing into the shadows, utterly and irrevocably silenced. The world did not sleep that night. It couldn't. The aftershocks of the debate were rolling across the globe, shaking the foundations of power from Washington, D.C. to Brussels to Beijing. In the immediate aftermath, as the studio lights were being powered down, a new, harsher light was being switched on, the light of consequence. The fallout was not gradual. It was instantaneous and brutal. For Barack Obama, the walk from the stage to his waiting motorcade was a journey through a nightmare. The familiar faces of aides and allies, people who had built their careers on his name, now looked at him with a new expression, fear. Their eyes darted away. Their smiles were tight, panicked masks. The usual backslapping and cries of "Great job, sir," were replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. He was no longer a leader to be celebrated. He was a contamination to be avoided. The ride back to his hotel was a study in isolation. He sat alone in the back of the armored Cadillac, the cold leather of the seat a stark contrast to the fire of humiliation burning in his gut. He stared out at the blur of city lights, but he didn't see them. He saw only the calm, steady eyes of J.D. Vance, and he heard only the echo of the word that had destroyed him: betrayal. Once inside his sprawling penthouse suite, the silence became his tormentor. He stood in the center of the vast, empty room, the city glittering below him like a distant, indifferent galaxy. The television was on, the volume muted, but the images were inescapable. On every channel, his own face, pale and defeated, was juxtaposed with Vance's, which was calm and resolute. Below the images, the chyrons told the story of his ruin. Obama legacy in tatters. Calls for congressional investigation into shadow presidency. Democratic Party in FREFALL after debate disaster. His phone, the device that had once been a conduit of global power, a direct line to every king, president, and billionaire on the planet, sat dark and silent on a marble table. It did not ring. The people who had once begged for a moment of his time were now running for cover, frantically distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of his collapse. When a call finally did come, it was not from an ally offering support. It was from a panicked, enraged party chairman. "What in God's name did you do, Barack?" The voice shrieked, devoid of its usual deference. "He brought up the Biden stuff. He brought up Russia. On live TV. Our entire midterm strategy is in flames. The donors are pulling out. You didn't just lose a debate. You may have just lost us the country for a generation." Obama listened, his jaw clenched, the words a fresh torrent of acid on his open wounds. He had no answer. He ended the call without speaking a word. The silence that returned was even heavier than before. It was the silence of a political grave. The calls for a congressional investigation were no longer a fringe demand. They were the lead story on every network. Senators who had once been his fiercest defenders were now issuing carefully worded statements about the need for transparency and the importance of upholding the integrity of our institutions. It was the language of political abandonment. The gears of Washington were already grinding, preparing to make him the sacrifice to save the party. For J.D. Vance, the experience was the mirror opposite. As he walked off stage, he was enveloped not by silence but by a wave of raw, tearful gratitude. Crew members, hardened professionals who had seen everything, reached out to shake his hand, their eyes glistening with emotion. A young female staffer, no older than 20, simply stood before him, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "Thank you." The word was filled with a meaning that went far beyond politics. Backstage, the atmosphere was not one of celebration. It was one of awe. Seasoned political operatives, men and women who had spent their lives in the brutal trenches of DC warfare, looked at him with a new reverence. He had not just won a debate. He had slain a dragon they all thought was immortal. His phone was buzzing incessantly, not with panic but with pledges of allegiance. Governors, senators, and power brokers from across the country were calling, their messages all the same. "We are with you. Tell us how we can help. You just saved the republic." The balance of power within the conservative movement had shifted on its axis in a single night. He was no longer just the vice president. He was the undisputed ideological leader, the voice of a reawakened America. In a quiet room away from the chaos, he finally stood face to face with President Trump. The president did not speak for a long moment. He simply looked at Vance, his eyes filled with a deep, profound pride. He clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "JD," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "Tonight you did what no one else in this world could have done. You spoke the truth, and you set this country free." Coming from a man who rarely shared the spotlight, it was the highest possible praise. It was a coronation. The legal fallout was just beginning. By dawn, the chairman of the House Judiciary and Oversight Committees had already announced a joint emergency session. The articles of their investigation were a direct transcript of Vance's accusations. The origins of the Russia probe, the use of the Steele dossier, and most explosively, a full inquiry into the health and fitness of the previous president, and who knew what when. The political world had been turned upside down. The hunters had become the hunted. The narrative that had dominated the media for nearly a decade had been shattered, and in its place was a new, terrible, and unavoidable question. What did the former president know, and when did he know it? The fall was not just political. It was total. In the days and weeks that followed, the debate was no longer a news story. It became a cultural touchstone, a moment that cleaved American history into a before and an after. The footage was replayed endlessly, not just on news channels, but in homes, in schools, in bars and churches. It was analyzed not like a political event, but like a sacred text, with people dissecting every word, every pause, every flicker of emotion on the faces of the three men who had stood at the heart of the storm. For Barack Obama, the legacy he had so carefully constructed over decades was immolated. He became a recluse, disappearing from the public eye, his silence a deafening admission of his defeat. The congressional investigations, fueled by a relentless public demand for truth, unearthed a mountain of evidence that corroborated Vance's every charge. The story of a shadow presidency, of a deep and profound deception, became not a conspiracy theory, but a verified, damning chapter in the history books. His name, once spoken with reverence in the halls of power, was now whispered with contempt, a cautionary tale of hubris and betrayal. He was a king in exile, stripped of his honor, left with nothing but the hollow echo of a lost kingdom. For Donald Trump, the night was a final, total vindication. For years, he had been a lone voice crying out in the wilderness, telling a truth that the world refused to hear. He had been mocked, vilified, and impeached for it. But on that stage, through the voice of his chosen vice president, that truth had been made manifest. He had been proven right. The victory was not just political, it was profoundly personal. He watched as the very people who had tried to destroy him were themselves consumed by the fire of their own lies. His second term, once beleaguered, was now empowered with an undeniable moral authority. He was no longer just a president, he was a vindicated prophet. And for J.D. Vance, the man from the forgotten heartland, the night was an ascension. He had walked onto that stage as a vice president, and he had walked off as the future. He had not just defended a president, he had given voice to the voiceless, given strength to the weary, and given hope to the forgotten. He had spoken a truth so raw and so powerful it had healed a nation's wounds. In the eyes of millions, he was no longer just a politician. He was a symbol of courage, of conviction, of the enduring power of the American spirit. He had reminded a nation that its strength did not come from the eloquent speeches of the powerful, but from the simple, unbreakable truth that resided in the hearts of its people. The debate stage, once a symbol of sterile political theater, had become something more. It had become a crucible where a nation's soul was tested, where lies were burned away, and where the truth, forged in the fire of confrontation, emerged stronger and purer than ever before. It was a reminder that history is not a gentle, flowing river, but a series of violent, world-changing moments. And on that one unforgettable night, a quiet warrior from Ohio had stepped into the arena, faced down a giant, and with nothing but the truth as his sword had changed the world. America was in tears. But for the first time in a long time, they were tears of hope, tears of pride, tears of a nation reborn. Now, if this story of courage moved you, if the fall of a corrupt establishment and the rise of a true patriot brought tears to your eyes, then your journey does not end here. This is more than just a story. It is a call to action. Hit that like button to show that you stand with the truth. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you never miss a moment of the history that is unfolding before our very eyes. And in the comments below, tell us, which moment of J.D. Vance's stand gave you the most hope for our future? The fight is not over. It has just begun. Let's make history together.